The morning sun painted the African savanna in shades of amber and gold, but Biscoito barely noticed any more. The miniature dachshund sat alone beneath the acacia tree's twisted shadow, his small body almost invisible against the red earth. His coat, once lustrous chocolate brown, had dulled from weeks of neglect, and his soulful eyes carried a sadness that seemed too heavy for such a tiny creature to bear. Around him, the sanctuary buzzed with purposeful energy. Caretakers rushed between enclosures, tending to lions recovering from injuries, orphan zebras learning to walk, and rescued chimpanzees chattering in spacious habitats. Everyone had somewhere important to be, something vital to do. Everyone except Biscoito. He had arrived 6 months ago, surrendered by owners who claimed he was too small and too much trouble. Sarah, the sanctuary director, had taken him in with good intentions, but urgent needs of larger, more dramatic rescues always took precedence. A dachshund didn't fit the narrative of an African wildlife sanctuary. He was just ... there. The loneliness carved itself deeper into his chest each day. He would watch caretakers celebrate when rescued animals took their first steps toward recovery, observe the joy that filled this place and feel none of it touch him. He was a ghost in a home full of life. Sometimes, late at night, Biscoito would look up at the vast African sky and think about purpose, about mattering, about what it meant to be needed. His small heart would swell with an inexplicable longing not just for love, but for significance. For a chance to prove that size didn't determine worth. Today felt different. The air carried strange electricity, tension that made the hair along his spine prickle. The staff seemed anxious, radios crackling with urgent messages. Dr. James, the sanctuary veterinarian, had been on the phone for hours, his voice tight with concern. Something was coming, something big. Biscoito lifted his snout to the wind, catching unfamiliar scents from the main gate. Pain, fear, desperation. These were smells he knew intimately. They matched the emotions he carried in his own small body. But this was different. This was catastrophic. As the sun descended, painting the horizon orange and crimson, Biscoito felt his heart quicken with an unfamiliar sensation. It wasn't quite hope he'd learned better than to hope, but it was something, a premonition, a whisper that his invisible existence was about to collide with something that would change everything. He didn't know that within hours, a traumatized baby elephant would arrive at the sanctuary gates. He didn't know that he, the forgotten dachshund everyone overlooked, would become the most important creature in this place. But somewhere deep in his small, brave heart, Biscoito sensed that his moment was finally coming. The truck arrived just after midnight, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Biscoito woke to urgent voices and heavy footsteps, the sanctuary transforming from peaceful nighttime rhythm into controlled chaos. He pressed his nose against the chain-link fence, watching as the massive vehicle backed toward the elephant enclosure. When they opened the trailer doors, the sound that emerged would haunt everyone who heard it. A cry of such profound anguish that it seemed to crack the very air. A baby elephant's trumpet of absolute devastation, raw and primal and completely broken. The baby elephant stumbled down the ramp, legs shaking so violently he could barely stand. His name was Kibo. Sarah explained to the gathered staff, her voice thick with emotion. He was 18 months old. 3 days ago, poachers had killed his mother for her ivory, leaving him standing beside her body, too traumatized to move. Rangers found him after 2 days, still refusing to leave his mother's side. In the harsh fluorescent lights, Kibo's condition became horrifyingly clear. His skin hung loose over his ribs, his eyes were vacant pools of shock. Dried mud caked his body, and deep scratches marked where he'd tried to wake his mother, pushing and prodding and refusing to accept what his young mind couldn't comprehend. Dr. James and his team worked with practiced efficiency, but their faces betrayed their worrying. They offered Kibo specially formulated elephant milk. He turned away. They brought fresh fruit. He showed no interest. They spoke in soothing voices, approached with gentle hands. He backed into the corner, trumpeting in terror, his entire body trembling. Sarah knelt outside the enclosure, tears streaming down her face. She'd been running this sanctuary for 15 years, had seen countless broken animals arrive at their gates, but something about Kibo's trauma cut deeper. This wasn't just physical injury. This was a soul-deep wound, the kind that might never heal. The night stretched on with increasing desperation. Every attempt to comfort Kibo met with the same response: fear, rejection, retreat. He stood swaying slightly, his trunk hanging limp, making that heartbreaking sound that seemed to contain all the world's suffering. By dawn, the team gathered for an emergency meeting. The veterinary assessment was grim. Kibo was severely dehydrated and malnourished. If he didn't eat and drink soon, his already fragile condition would deteriorate rapidly. But more concerning was his psychological trauma. He wouldn't let anyone close enough to help him. "We've tried everything," Dr. James said, exhaustion making his voice rough. "Every technique, every approach, he's completely shut down. I've never seen trauma this severe in an elephant this young." Ideas flew around the table: different formulas, medications, even bringing in an elephant from a nearby reserve as a companion. But each suggestion felt hollow. They all knew the truth. Kibo wasn't rejecting food because he couldn't accept it. He was rejecting life itself. In his kennel across the sanctuary, Biscoito sat very still, ears perked forward, catching fragments of those desperate conversations. He could still hear Kibo's mournful cries, softer now, but somehow more heartbreaking for their exhaustion. The sound spoke directly to something deep inside the little dachshund, recognized trauma calling to unacknowledged pain. The staff returned to their stations, movements heavy with defeat. They would keep trying, of course, but the unspoken truth hung over them all like a dark cloud. Nothing was working. For 2 days, Biscoito watched from a distance. The sanctuary orbited around the elephants suffering. Staff members came and went from Kibo's enclosure with increasing desperation. The baby elephant's cries had diminished to occasional whimpers, which somehow felt worse, as if he was giving up even on expressing his pain. Biscoito found himself drawn to the enclosure's perimeter, sitting for hours listening. While everyone else saw an elephant, he heard something else. He heard the sound of abandonment, of being lost in a world that suddenly made no sense, of wanting nothing more than for the pain to stop. These were feelings he understood intimately. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, something shifted. Sarah sat outside the enclosure, her head in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I don't know what else to do," she whispered to Dr. James. "He's slipping away, and I can't reach him." Biscoito moved closer, his small body low to the ground, paused, barely making a sound. He'd learned long ago how to make himself invisible, how to move through spaces without being noticed. The gap in the enclosure fence was too small for a person, barely noticeable. For a miniature dachshund, it was a perfect doorway. Biscoito paused at the opening, his heart hammering. Every instinct screamed at him to stay safe, stay small, stay invisible. But Kibo's quiet whimpering pulled at something deeper than instinct. He squeezed through. The enclosure felt massive from ground level. Biscoito's paws touched the ground on the other side, and for a moment, he froze, suddenly aware of how exposed he was. Kibo stood in the far corner, his massive form somehow looking small and broken. Biscoito took a tentative step forward, then another. His approach was neither bold nor timid, it was simply inevitable, like a compass needle finding north. He didn't make a sound, didn't rush, didn't do anything that might seem threatening. He just walked. Kibo's ear flickered slightly, his head lifted, the first time in days he'd shown interest in anything. His eyes struggled to focus on the tiny figure crossing the vast space between them. The elephant's entire body went still, confusion briefly penetrating the fog of his grief. What was this impossibly small creature? Why was it coming closer when every other being had felt like a threat? The little animal moved with no agenda, no forceful energy, no demands. It was just there, present, unafraid. Biscoito stopped about 10 feet away, sitting on his haunches, his tail giving a small, hopeful wag. He tilted his head slightly, his liquid brown eyes meeting Kibo's for the first time. In that moment, something passed between them, not understanding exactly, but recognition, to lost souls seeing each other clearly. Minutes stretched like honey, thick and slow. Neither moved. They simply existed in the same space, breathing the same air, sharing the same profound loneliness. Kibo's trunk slowly lifted from the ground, swaying slightly. The dachshund's scent reached him, earth and dust, and something indefinably gentle. The baby elephant took a single step forward, then another. His movements were cautious, so different from the panic he'd shown everyone else. Biscoito remained perfectly still, his heart racing but his body calm, offering nothing but quiet presence. Kibo's trunk extended, the tip exploring the air around the tiny dog with delicate curiosity. Biscoito let it come, didn't flinch or retreat. The elephant's trunk gently touched his head, barely more than a whisper of contact, and for the first time since arriving at the sanctuary, Kibo's whimpering stopped. Complete silence fell over the enclosure. Outside, Sarah looked up, her breath catching. Dr. James grabbed his binoculars, not quite believing what he was seeing. The entire staff began to gather, drawn by the sudden absence of Kibo's cries, their faces reflecting pure astonishment. As the sun touched the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, Kibo lowered his massive head until it was nearly level with the ground. Biscoito took 3 steps forward and gently touched his nose to the elephant's trunk. The staff outside could hardly believe what they were witnessing. After 3 days of absolute rejection, this tiny dog, this forgotten, overlooked dachshund, had somehow found a way in. But this was only the beginning. The African night descended quickly, wrapping the sanctuary in velvet darkness punctuated by millions of stars. The staff made the difficult decision to leave Biscoito in the enclosure overnight. Every instinct screamed to intervene, but something told them this connection was too precious to disrupt. Sarah positioned herself outside with night vision equipment, while Dr. James set up camp nearby with emergency medical supplies. Inside the enclosure, the mismatched pair moved through their own careful dance of trust building. Kibo had taken several more steps toward Biscoito, his movements slow and deliberate, as if approaching something sacred that might shatter if handled roughly. The little dachshund remained remarkably calm, his instincts telling him that fear would break whatever delicate bridge they were building. The elephant's trunk continued its gentle exploration, touching Biscoito's ears, trailing down his back, learning the contours of this tiny creature with tender curiosity. Each contact seemed to pull Kibo further from the dark place his trauma had imprisoned him. His breathing, which had been shallow and rapid since arrival, began to deepen and slow. Biscoito responded with soft sounds, not quite whimpers, not quite barks, but something in between. Gentle vocalizations that seemed to say, "I'm here. I see you. You're not alone." His tail maintained a steady, slow wag, broadcasting calm and acceptance. He'd never felt this sensation before, being needed, being important, being the solution to someone else's pain. As the hours passed, something remarkable began to happen. Kibo, who hadn't rested since watching his mother die, who'd stood rigid with grief for days, began to sway less. His massive legs started to bend. He was considering something that had seemed impossible, lying down, surrendering to rest, accepting that life might continue despite everything. Sarah, watching through her night vision scope, gripped Dr. James's arm. "Is he?" she whispered, hardly daring to hope. Kibo's front legs buckled first, folding beneath his chest with surprising grace. His back legs followed, and with a deep exhale that seemed to release some of the trauma he'd been holding, the baby elephant lowered himself fully to the ground. For the first time in 72 agonizing hours, he lay down. Biscoito's response was immediate and instinctive. The little dachshund padded forward until he found the perfect spot, the space between the elephant's front legs and his chest, a protected hollow where the elephant's breath created warm currents in the cooling night air. Without hesitation, Biscoito circled once, twice, then curled into a tight ball against Kibo's chest. The elephant's trunk came to rest gently across the dachshund's small body, not constraining but embracing, a gesture so tender it brought tears to the eyes of everyone watching. Kibo's eyes, which had been empty pools of trauma, slowly closed, his breathing deepened further. The rigid tension that had held his body in crisis mode for days began to melt away. Biscoito pressed closer, his small heartbeat steady and sure against the elephant's chest. He'd found his purpose. This was what he'd been waiting for, not to be cared for, but to care. Not to receive love, but to give it. His own abandonment, his own pain, suddenly had meaning. He understood trauma because he carried it. He could reach Kibo because he knew what it felt like to be lost. Around 3 in the morning, something even more remarkable occurred. Kibo's trunk tightened slightly around Biscoito, pulling him closer, and the elephant released a soft rumble from deep in his chest. It wasn't distress, it was contentment, the first positive sound he'd made since arriving. Dawn arrived slowly, painting the sky in graduated shades of pink and orange. As the first rays of sunlight touched the enclosure, Biscoito stirred first, lifting his head to look at his unlikely companion. Kibo's eyes opened to find the little dog still there, still present, still real. The elephant's trunk gently touched Biscoito's head, confirming reality. The little dog stood, stretched in that distinctive dachshund way, and then did something that made the watching staff gasp. He leaned forward and licked Kibo's trunk, a gesture of affection so pure, so uncomplicated, that it seemed to communicate everything words could not. "You're safe now. We're in this together." Kibo rumbled again, that same sound of contentment, and slowly pushed himself back to his feet. He stood taller than before, the crushing weight of isolation slightly lighter. The trauma hadn't disappeared, but something had shifted. He wasn't alone anymore. The impossible had happened. The tiny dog nobody noticed had accomplished what all their expertise and experience could not. But something unexpected would emerge from this bond. The morning after their first night together marked the beginning of a routine that would define both their lives. As sunlight flooded the enclosure, Dr. James approached with Kibo's morning formula. In previous attempts, the baby elephant had turned away before the bottle even came close. Today, with Biscoito sitting alertly at his feet, everything changed. Kibo watched the veterinarian approach, his body tensing slightly with residual wariness. But then the little dachshund stood and walked calmly toward Dr. James, his tail wagging, showing no fear. The message was clear. This human is safe. Kibo's trunk reached out tentatively, and when Dr. James knelt and offered the bottle, the elephant glanced down at the small dog beside him. Biscoito sat, his expression encouraging, his presence a steady anchor. The elephant's trunk wrapped slowly around the bottle, and for the first time since his arrival, he drank. The sound of him feeding brought cheers from the staff gathered at a respectful distance. But when they tried to repeat the feeding an hour later without Biscoito present, Kibo refused. He backed into his corner, trunk wrapped protectively around his body, eyes wide with renewed anxiety. The moment Biscoito returned, trotting back through his special gap in the fence, everything shifted. Kibo's entire demeanor transformed, and when the bottle was offered again, he drank readily. The pattern was unmistakable. Over the following days, this dynamic solidified into an unbreakable rule. Kibo would only eat when Biscoito was present. Not just nearby, the little dachshund had to be actively engaged, sitting close enough to touch, visible within the elephant's line of sight. The relationship evolved beyond simple comfort. Biscoito had become Kibo's interpreter of the world, his guide through the confusing process of learning to trust again. When new caretakers approached, Kibo would watch Biscoito's reaction first. If the dog remained calm and friendly, Kibo would cautiously accept the newcomer. The little dachshund took his role with surprising seriousness. His entire demeanor had transformed. The sad, overlooked dog who'd wandered the sanctuary invisibly had become purposeful and confident. He walked with his head high, his stride more assured. He found his calling. Their daily routine developed its own rhythm. Each morning, Biscoito would wake Kibo with gentle nudges and soft barks. They would walk the perimeter of the enclosure together, Kibo's massive form moving slowly to accommodate his tiny companion's short legs. The elephant would pause frequently to check on Biscoito, ensuring the little dog was still close, still present, still real. During feeding times, Biscoito stationed himself like a small sentinel, sitting upright while Kibo ate. His presence worked like magic, transforming mealtime from a source of trauma-induced anxiety into something approaching normalcy. The transformation in Kibo was remarkable. Within a week, he'd gained weight. His skin regained some of its healthy elasticity. The vacant look in his eyes began to recede, replaced by flickers of the curiosity and playfulness natural to young elephants. He still carried the trauma that would likely never fully disappear, but Biscoito's constant presence provided a lifeline back to living. By the second week, their walks had extended beyond the enclosure. With staff supervision, Biscoito and Kibo were allowed to explore the sanctuary's central grounds together. The sight was simultaneously beautiful and almost comical. A miniature dachshund leading a baby elephant on adventures, the massive creature following the tiny dog with complete trust. Kibo had learned to modulate his movements around Biscoito with extraordinary care. Despite his increasing strength and size, he never stepped carelessly, never moved without awareness of where his small guardian was positioned. When Biscoito wanted to rest, Kibo would lie down immediately, curling his body protectively around the little dog. When Biscoito wanted to explore, Kibo would follow, his trunk occasionally lifting the dachshund over obstacles too tall for his short legs. The bond had evolved into something that transcended typical animal relationships. Biscoito wasn't just a companion, he was Kibo's emotional support, his therapist, his anchor to life itself. And for the little dachshund, who'd spent months feeling invisible and purposeless, this role filled a void he hadn't even known he could fill. He mattered, he was essential, he was loved. But the staff began to notice something troubling. Kibo's dependence on Biscoito, while beautiful and healing, was also becoming absolute. Any separation, even brief ones, sent the elephant into mild panic. Late one afternoon, as Sarah watched them nap together under their favorite acacia tree, Dr. James' voice that concerned everyone was thinking, what happens when Biscoito, in here? When biology demands they be apart. As the sun set that evening, Biscoito led Kibo back to their enclosure, his tail wagging contentedly, unaware of the staff's worries. He found his purpose. He'd found his friend. Nothing else mattered. But this dependency would bring dangers neither of them could anticipate. It started with a gate left accidentally unlatched. Maria, one of the newer caretakers, had been checking on the antelope enclosure when her radio squawked with an emergency. In her rush to respond, she'd failed to fully secure the gate separating Kibo's area from the sanctuary's wooded section, a mistake that would nearly cost both animals their lives. Biscoito had been called away for a routine veterinary check. Just 30 minutes, a quick examination of a small cut on his paw. It should have been nothing. But 30 minutes felt like an eternity to Kibo. The young elephant had watched his small guardian disappear into the medical building, and as the minutes stretched, his anxiety crescendoed into full panic. The elephant's trumpeting started soft but grew increasingly desperate. He paced the enclosure, his trunk reaching toward the building where Biscoito had vanished. The caretakers tried to soothe him, offering treats and gentle words, but nothing penetrated his distress. Biscoito was gone, and Kibo's trauma had taught him that gone meant forever. When the young elephant spotted the unlatched gate swinging slightly in the afternoon breeze, instinct overrode training, he had to find Biscoito. With surprising speed, Kibo pushed through the opening and disappeared into the dense forest that bordered the sanctuary. The alarm went up immediately. Elephant loose, Kibo's in the forest. Within seconds, the sanctuary exploded into controlled chaos. Staff members grabbed tranquilizer equipment and medical supplies, organizing into search teams with practiced efficiency. In the medical building, Biscoito's examination had just finished when the commotion began. The little dachshund's ears perked at the sound of Kibo's distressed trumpeting echoing from somewhere in the distance. He began to bark frantically, his small body rigid with alarm. Kibo's escaped. He's in the forest. Dr. James burst through the door. Sarah's face went pale. The forest beyond the sanctuary boundaries was raw Africa, home to leopards, hyenas, and countless other dangers. A traumatized baby elephant in a panic state could hurt himself catastrophically. Biscoito didn't wait for permission. The moment the door opened, he shot out like a small brown bullet, his nose to the ground, following Kibo's scent with single-minded determination. Sarah shouted after him, but the dachshund was already gone, disappearing into the underbrush with impossible speed for his short legs. "We need to follow that dog," Dr. James said, his voice tight. "He'll find Kibo faster than any of us." The forest swallowed Biscoito into its shadows. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the canopy in scattered patches, creating a maze of light and darkness. The little dachshund ran with purpose, his sensitive nose tracking the elephant's distinctive scent through the complex tapestry of forest smells. Behind him, he could hear the search teams crashing through the brush, but they were too slow, too loud. He was Kibo's only real hope. The elephant's trail led deeper into the forest, toward a rocky area where the trees grew thicker and the ground became treacherous. Biscoito's heart hammered against his ribs. Fear for his friend overrode any concern for his own safety. Then the scent hit him like a physical blow. Predator, fresh, close. Biscoito skidded to a halt, his small body freezing as every instinct screamed danger. The smell was big cat mixed with the metallic tang of recent kill. His ears swiveled, catching the soft sound of breathing from somewhere above. Leopards hunted from trees. Then he heard Kibo's frightened trumpeting from just ahead. The elephant had stumbled into a small clearing, his massive form turning in anxious circles, calling for his missing friend. And in the trees surrounding the clearing, golden eyes watched with calculated interest. The leopard was magnificent and terrifying, a full-grown male, easily 3 times Biscoito's weight, his spotted coat rippling over powerful muscles as he crept along a thick branch. The predator had been stalking nearby prey when the panicked elephant had crashed into his territory, but now his attention had shifted. Biscoito's mind raced. He couldn't fight a leopard, the idea was absurd. But he couldn't let the predator reach Kibo either. The elephant was already traumatized beyond measure. A predator attack could break him completely. The little dachshund made a decision that defied every survival instinct in his small body. He charged into the clearing, barking with everything he had, a sharp, aggressive sound designed to draw attention. "Here, I'm here. Look at me, not him." The leopard's head snapped toward this unexpected challenger. Confusion flickered in those golden eyes. But predators are opportunistic, and Biscoito had just made himself a much easier target. Kibo's reaction was immediate. His trumpeting transformed from distress to alarm as he spotted both his beloved friend and the predator simultaneously. The elephant charged toward Biscoito, his protective instincts overwhelming his panic. The roles had reversed. Kibo would protect his guardian. The leopard launched from his branch just as Biscoito dove sideways, his small size allowing him to slip beneath a tangle of exposed roots where the big cat couldn't follow. The predator landed hard, snarling his frustration, circling the root system where the little dog had taken refuge. One massive paw slashed into the opening, claws extended, nearly catching Biscoito's haunches. Kibo arrived like a freight train, his young bulk still substantial enough to be dangerous. He trumpeted a challenge, a sound carrying both fear and fury, and charged the leopard. The big cat, suddenly facing an angry elephant rather than easy prey, made the calculation all predators must make. Was this worth the risk? The answer came in the form of gunfire, not aimed to kill, but to scare. The search team had arrived, Dr. James in the lead, firing warning shots into the air. The combination of an enraged elephant, armed humans, and the persistent barking from the impossible little dog beneath the roots was too much. The leopard melted back into the forest shadows. Biscoito emerged from his hiding spot, his small body shaking with adrenaline but otherwise unharmed. Kibo's trunk immediately enveloped him, lifting him gently into the air, checking every inch of his tiny companion for injuries. The elephant's distress was palpable. He'd nearly lost the one being that made life bearable. "Let's get them home," Dr. James said, his voice unsteady. "Let's get everyone home." The walk back felt eternal. Kibo refused to let Biscoito walk, carrying him carefully in his trunk the entire way, as if afraid the little dog might disappear if he touched the ground. The dachshund didn't protest, curling into the trunk's gentle hold, his own heart still racing from the encounter. As they emerged from the forest, the setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and crimson. The staff gathered, their faces reflecting awe and concern in equal measure. The little dachshund, who'd been forgotten for months, had just risked his life to save a baby elephant. The elephant, who'd been too traumatized to live, had charged a leopard to protect his tiny friend. Sarah watched them disappear into their enclosure, Kibo still refusing to put Biscoito down. After this, she whispered to Dr. James, "Nothing will ever be the same." She had no idea how right she was. It started with a single photograph. One of the sanctuary volunteers had captured the moment when Kibo carried Biscoito back from the forest, the tiny dachshund cradled in the elephant's trunk, both animals visibly exhausted but safe. The image was stunning, the contrast of size, the obvious tenderness, the golden hour lighting creating an almost ethereal quality. Sarah posted it on the sanctuary's Facebook page with a simple caption, "Sometimes the biggest heroes come in the smallest packages." Biscoito the dachshund saved baby elephant Kibo from danger today. These two have the most incredible bond we've ever witnessed. What happened next was beyond anything they could have anticipated. Within 24 hours, the post had been shared 10,000 times. By the end of the week, the number had climbed to over 1 million. Major news outlets picked up the story: BBC, CNN, National Geographic, the Dodo. The sanctuary's phone rang constantly with interview requests from journalists around the globe. The story had everything: tragedy, unlikely friendship, heroism, hope. In a world saturated with bad news, the tale of a tiny dog befriending and protecting a traumatized elephant offered something precious, proof that compassion transcends size, species, and circumstance. Television crews descended on the sanctuary. Sarah insisted on one condition: any filming had to be done carefully, without stressing Kibo or disrupting his routine with Biscoito. The animals came first, always. The footage captured during these visits was magical. Cameras recorded Biscoito leading Kibo on their daily walks, the elephant's trunk occasionally reaching down to touch his small friend reassuringly. They filmed feeding time, showing how Kibo would only eat when the little dachshund sat nearby. They documented nap time, with Biscoito curled against the elephant's massive chest, both animals sleeping peacefully. But the most powerful footage came from the play sessions. As Kibo's confidence grew, his natural elephant playfulness began to emerge. He would spray water from his trunk, carefully aiming over Biscoito's head rather than at him, then rumble with what could only be described as laughter when the little dog would shake himself dry with exaggerated indignation. Biscoito would chase the elephant around the enclosure, his short legs pumping furiously while Kibo lumbered along at a deliberately slow pace, pretending his tiny friend was gaining on him. These moments of joy, captured on camera and shared worldwide, became viral sensations. The sanctuary's social media following exploded to over 5 million across platforms. #Bisquito and Kibo trended globally. Artists created paintings and drawings. Someone even wrote a children's book, with proceeds donated to the sanctuary. The financial impact was immediate and transformative. Donations poured in from around the world, small contributions from individuals touched by the story, and substantial grants from animal welfare organizations. Within 2 months, the sanctuary had raised enough to expand facilities, hire additional staff, and launch new rescue programs. But the most touching responses came from children. Letters arrived daily, handwritten in crayon and marker, telling Biscoito and Kibo how much they were loved. Kids sent drawings, toys, and even their own stuffed animals. A school in Japan adopted the sanctuary as their charity project. A group of children in Brazil organized a fundraising campaign. Sarah created a special area in the sanctuary office to display these treasures. The walls became covered with children's artwork drawings of a tiny brown dog standing proudly beside a giant gray elephant, both animals smiling in the simplified way only children's art can capture. The sanctuary itself underwent dramatic changes. The increased funding allowed for significant improvements, better medical facilities, expanded enclosures, improved enrichment programs for all animals. More rescued animals could be accepted. The staff grew from 8 to 23. But fame brought challenges too. Visitors wanted to see the famous pair, necessitating careful management to protect Kibo and Biscoito's privacy. The sanctuary implemented viewing times and strict rules: no loud noises, no flash photography, maintain distance. Biscoito himself seemed bewildered by the attention. When film crews were present, he'd look at the cameras with his head tilted, as if wondering what all the fuss was about. He was just doing what felt natural, being there for his friend. The concept of fame meant nothing to him. What mattered was Kibo. 6 months after the story went viral, the sanctuary held a special celebration for major donors and supporters. At sunset, Sarah arranged something special. As the golden light painted the savannah, the two friends were led to a viewing area where supporters could see them from a respectful distance. Kibo, now noticeably larger and healthier than when he'd arrived, walked confidently beside Biscoito. The little dachshund strutted with his characteristic swagger, his tail held high, leading his enormous friend past the watching crowd. The sight brought tears to many eyes, this living embodiment of hope, resilience, and the power of unlikely connections. But Sarah couldn't shake a nagging worrying that lived in the back of her mind. The bond between Biscoito and Kibo was profound and healing, but it was also absolute. The elephant's entire emotional well-being remained tied to the dog's presence. And Biscoito, while healthy and energetic, was aging. As the sun disappeared below the horizon and the first stars appeared, Biscoito and Kibo settled together under their favorite acacia tree. The fame, the attention, the money, none of it mattered to them. They had each other, and for now, that was everything. But their friendship would face its greatest test yet. 18 months passed in a rhythm of peaceful companionship and continued growth. The changes were remarkable. Kibo had transformed from a traumatized baby into a healthy young elephant, his body filling out with proper nutrition and his eyes regaining the sparkle of youth. He now stood over 6 feet tall at the shoulder, his weight having tripled. He was becoming magnificent, powerful, intelligent, increasingly confident. Biscoito had changed too, though in different ways. He moved a bit slower now, his steps not quite as quick as they once were. Gray hair sprouted around his muzzle and eyes, giving him a distinguished appearance. He was 10 years old now, and while he remained energetic and devoted to his friend, the staff noticed subtle signs of aging: a slight stiffness in the mornings, longer afternoon naps, a preference for shade over sun. Yet the bond between them had only deepened. The size disparity that had been dramatic from the beginning was now almost comical. Kibo could have crushed his small friend with one careless step, but the elephant had developed an almost supernatural awareness of Biscoito's presence, moving with exquisite care whenever the little dog was nearby. Their daily routine had evolved into a carefully choreographed dance. Each morning, Kibo would wake first, remaining perfectly still until Biscoito stirred. The moment the little dachshund's eyes opened, Kibo's trunk would gently lift him, a morning ritual that never failed to make the staff smile. The elephant would carry his friend outside, setting him down carefully on the soft grass. Walks had become adventures in patience and accommodation. Kibo had learned to match his pace precisely to Biscoito's shorter stride. When the little dog needed to rest more frequently now than in earlier months, Kibo would lie down immediately, curling his massive body protectively around his tiny companion. The elephant had also developed remarkable problem-solving skills focused entirely on Biscoito's comfort. When the rainy season arrived and the grounds turned muddy, Kibo would use his trunk to lift Biscoito over the worst puddles. When the afternoon sun grew too intense, he positioned his body to create shade for the little dog. When Biscoito's joints made climbing difficult, Kibo would lower himself completely flat, allowing his friend to walk up his trunk like a ramp. Their communication had evolved beyond simple companionship into something approaching telepathy. Biscoito could signal his intentions with the slightest gesture, a glance toward the water trough, and Kibo would lead them there. A small whimper, and the elephant would lie down for a nap session. Their favorite game had become legendary among sanctuary visitors. Biscoito would bark his characteristic challenge, and Kibo would flee at an exaggeratedly slow pace, his trunk raised in mock fear, occasionally glancing back to ensure his tiny pursuer was keeping up. When Biscoito inevitably caught him, usually by running between the elephant's front legs, Kibo would gently blow air from his trunk, ruffling the little dog's fur, sending Biscoito into a spinning dance of playful barking. But there were quiet moments too, increasingly frequent, when Biscoito would simply rest against Kibo's chest, and the elephant would drape his trunk gently across the little dog's body, and they would exist together in perfect, peaceful silence. The sanctuary had expanded significantly, now housing over 40 rescued animals. But Biscoito and Kibo remained the heart and soul of the place, their story the foundation upon which everything else was built. One particular afternoon stood out in everyone's memory. A little girl visiting with her family had been watching from the designated viewing area when Biscoito suddenly seemed to lose his balance. Before the Dachshund could stumble, Kibo's trunk was there, not grabbing, not pulling, just supporting. The elephant had sensed the wobble before it fully happened, his awareness of his friend's every movement so acute that he could anticipate and prevent problems before they occurred. As the sun set that evening, painting the savannah in shades of purple and gold, Biscoito and Kibo settled into their favorite spot under the acacia tree. The elephant arranged himself carefully, creating the perfect nest of his body for the little dog to curl into. His trunk rested gently across Biscoito, a living blanket of protection and love. The staff, watching from a distance, knew they were witnessing something rare and precious. This wasn't just friendship, it was devotion in its purest form. But fate was about to test the strength of that devotion in ways none of them were prepared for. It started with something so small that only Kibo noticed. 3 days of Biscoito moving slightly slower, his appetite marginally decreased, his usual morning enthusiasm just a fraction less bright. To human eyes, the changes were negligible. But to an elephant, whose entire existence centered on his small friend's well-being, they were catastrophic alarm bells. Kibo's behavior shifted immediately. He refused to leave Biscoito's side even for feeding. His trunk constantly checked the little dog, touching his head to monitor temperature, gently pressing his sides, hovering with anxious attention. The elephant's rumbles took on a distressed quality that made the staff's hearts ache. On the 4th morning, Biscoito didn't wake at his usual time. When Dr. James arrived for the morning rounds and saw the little dachshund still curled motionless in Kibo's protective embrace, his stomach dropped. The elephant's eyes were wide with panic, his trunk wrapped carefully around his friend, as if physical contact alone could will him back to health. "Easy, Kibo. Let me see him. Buddy, I need to help." Dr. James approached slowly, speaking in soothing tones. The elephant's response was immediate and heartbreaking, a high-pitched trumpet of pure anguish, his body trembling. He pulled Biscoito closer, unwilling to relinquish the one thing that mattered most. It took Sarah and 3 other staff members, plus every treat they could find, to convince Kibo to let them take Biscoito to the veterinary clinic. The moment the little dog was lifted from his protective embrace, Kibo's distress reached levels they'd never witnessed. He paced frantically, trumpeting constantly, his trunk reaching toward the clinic building as if he could pull his friend back through sheer will. Staff members tried to comfort him, but nothing penetrated his panic. In the clinic, Dr. James worked quickly, his experienced hands examining the small patient with urgent care, temperature elevated, heart rate irregular, labored breathing. Blood work showed kidney values dangerously high. The diagnosis was acute kidney infection, possibly triggered by his aging body's decreased immune response. "Can you save him?" Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. Dr. James was already preparing for fluids and antibiotics. "We're going to try everything." But Sarah... he's not young anymore. His body might not have the reserves to fight this. Outside, Kibo's cries could be heard across the entire sanctuary, a sound so filled with grief and fear that it brought staff members to tears. Other animals grew restless, affected by the elephant's distress. The first night was critical. Biscoito lay motionless on the examination table, for lines running into his small foreleg, oxygen support helping his labored breathing. Dr. James and 2 veterinary assistants took shifts, monitoring vitals, adjusting medications, doing everything medical science could offer. But outside the clinic, something equally important was happening. Kibo had positioned himself directly in front of the building's main window, lying down with his trunk extended toward the glass, as if trying to reach through to his friend. He hadn't eaten since Biscoito was taken, hadn't slept, hadn't moved except to shift his position slightly every few hours, always maintaining his vigil. Sarah brought him food, water, special treats, all refused. She sat with him through the night, her hand on his massive shoulder, tears streaming down her face. "He's fighting, Kibo. Biscoito is fighting so hard to come back to you." By the second day, Biscoito's condition had stabilized slightly but remained critical. The little dog's eyes would occasionally flutter open, unfocused and confused, before closing again. Each time Dr. James checked his vitals, he'd see marginal improvements, small victories in a battle that remained far from won. Kibo had become a statue of grief outside the clinic. Staff members took turns sitting vigil with him, but he remained locked in his private hell of waiting. His only movement was that constant, heartbreaking reach of his trunk toward the window. News of Biscoito's illness spread globally within hours. The sanctuary's social media channels were flooded with messages, prayers, good wishes, desperate pleas from millions of followers who'd come to love this unlikely pair. Children drew pictures of Biscoito getting well, sending them to the sanctuary by the hundreds. An online fundraiser for his medical care raised over $100,000 in less than a day. Dr. James barely slept, maintaining his watch over the small patient with fierce determination. This wasn't just any dog, this was Biscoito, whose courage had saved an elephant's life, whose presence had transformed the entire sanctuary. On the third night, something shifted. Biscoito's eyes opened with more clarity, focusing on Dr. James's face. The little dog's tail gave a weak but unmistakable wag. The veterinarian's whoop of joy brought staff running from all directions. "He's turning the corner. The antibiotics are working." Outside, as if sensing the change, Kibo suddenly stood. His trunk lifted, testing the air, reading something the humans couldn't detect. A low rumble emerged from his chest, not distress this time, but something else. Hope. Recovery was slow and gradual. Each day brought small improvements, Biscoito eating a little more, standing for brief periods, responding with more energy. But his eyes constantly searched for something that wasn't there. He would whimper softly, confused by Kibo's absence. Dr. James made the decision on day 7. He's stable enough. Let's take him to see Kibo, even if just for a few minutes. The reunion happened in the early evening, when the golden light made everything look softer, more hopeful. Staff members carefully carried Biscoito, still weak but alert, toward the elephant who hadn't moved from his post in a week. Kibo's reaction was instantaneous. His trunk reached out with exquisite gentleness, touching Biscoito, though carefully, as if the little dog might shatter at rough contact. The elephant's rumble was soft and filled with indescribable emotion, relief, joy, love, all combined into a sound that made every witness weep openly. Biscoito's tail began to wag with increasing strength, his entire small body trembling with the effort of expressing his joy at being reunited. He licked Kibo's trunk weakly, making soft sounds of recognition and contentment. Over the following week, the visits increased twice daily, then 3 times. Then finally, after 2 full weeks, Dr. James made his pronouncement: he can go home. He's not completely recovered, but being with Kibo will do more for his healing than anything else we can offer. When Biscoito walked out of the clinic on his own, for legs still shaky, still thin, but alive and improving, something incredible happened. The entire sanctuary staff had gathered without being asked, drawn by some collective understanding that this moment mattered. They lined the path from the clinic to Kibo's enclosure, silent witnesses to a reunion that had seemed impossible just 2 weeks earlier. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the red earth, and somewhere in the distance, a lion's roar announced the approaching evening. Biscoito emerged from the clinic doorway slowly, his legs still uncertain beneath him, his small body bearing the evidence of his battle with illness. Gray hairs around his muzzle seemed more pronounced now, his movements more careful. But his eyes, those soulful brown eyes, shone with unmistakable determination and joy. Kibo had been pacing near the fence since morning, as if he knew this day would be different. The moment the clinic door opened, the elephant froze, his massive body going completely still except for his trunk, which rose to test the air. When Biscoito's scent reached him, not filtered through glass or distance, but real and present and alive, the elephant released a sound unlike anything the staff had ever heard from him. It wasn't quite a trumpet, not quite a rumble, but something in between, a vocalization of pure, unrestrained emotion that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Joy, relief, love beyond measure. Biscoito began his walk, each step measured and deliberate. The distance from the clinic to Kibo's enclosure was perhaps 50 yards, but it might as well have been 50 miles. The little dachshund's short legs worked with visible effort, his breathing coming in soft pants, but he never hesitated. His eyes remained locked on his friend, his tail wagging with increasing strength as the distance closed. Sarah had opened the enclosure gate, and Kibo stood just inside, vibrating with the effort of restraining himself. Every instinct screamed at him to run to his friend, to cover the distance in 3 massive strides, but some deep understanding kept him still. Biscoito needed to complete this journey himself. This walk was about more than reunion. It was about proving he could, about reclaiming his role, about showing that death hadn't won. Staff members openly wept as they watched the little dog's progress. Dr. James stood with his hand over his mouth, tears streaming down his face. Maria sobbed into her hands. Even the sanctuary's toughest veterans found themselves undone by the simple power of this moment. Halfway across the distance, Biscoito paused to rest, his sides heaving. Kibo made a soft sound, a gentle encouragement, and the little dog's tail wagged once in response before he continued. Step by step, inch by inch, the gap closed. When Biscoito finally reached the enclosure entrance, Kibo could contain himself no longer. The elephant lowered himself completely to the ground, flattening his massive body until his chest touched the earth, his trunk extending along the ground like a living bridge. The message was clear and heartbreaking in its thoughtfulness. I will make myself as small as I can be. I will meet you where you are. Biscoito walked forward until he could press his small nose against Kibo's trunk, and the elephant's entire body shuddered with emotion. His trunk wrapped gently around the little dog, not lifting, not constraining, just holding. They remained that way for several minutes, neither moving, both simply existing in the reality of being together again. When Kibo finally stood, his movements were slower than usual, infinitely careful. His trunk lifted Biscoito with the delicacy of handling the most precious object in existence, bringing the little dog to rest against his chest, right over his heart. The elephant's rumble was soft and constant, a sound of contentment and relief and unbreakable devotion. The staff began to disperse, giving them privacy, but Sarah lingered, watching as Kibo carried Biscoito toward their favorite acacia tree. The elephant moved with exquisite slowness, each step placed with absolute precision, ensuring the ride was as smooth as possible for his recovering friend. As they walked, The sun began its descent toward the horizon, transforming the African sky into a masterpiece of color, brilliant oranges bleeding into deep purples, gold-edged clouds floating like islands in an ocean of light. It was the kind of sunset that makes people believe in magic, in purpose, in the fundamental goodness woven through existence. Beneath the acacia tree, Kibo carefully lowered himself down, creating the perfect nest of his body. But instead of placing Biscoito in their usual position against his chest, the elephant did something extraordinary. He positioned himself flat and low, then gently placed the little dog on his back, right between his shoulder blades. Biscoito stood there for a moment, confused, then understanding dawned. Slowly, carefully, Kibo began to rise, lifting his small friend skyward, giving him the view from height, allowing him to see the world from an elephant's perspective. The little dachshund's tail began to wag with increasing vigor as he stood on his friend's back, surveying the golden savanna stretching endlessly all directions. And then they walked, together like this elephant and dog, giant and tiny, survivor and savior. They walked through the sanctuary grounds as the sunset painted everything in shades of impossible beauty. Kibo moved with the slow dignity of a king, his trunk occasionally reaching back to steady Biscoito when the terrain changed. The little dog stood proudly on his friend's back, looking for all the world like he was riding into legend. Staff members who caught glimpses of this sight stopped what they were doing, hands pressed to their hearts. Several grabbed cameras, capturing images that would later be shared millions of times across the globe. The tiny dachshund riding the elephant through a golden African sunset, both silhouetted against the dying light, the very picture of triumph over adversity. They circled the grounds once, twice, then headed back to their tree as the sun touched the horizon. Kibo lowered himself again, and Biscoito climbed carefully down, settling into his familiar spot against the elephant's chest. Kibo's trunk draped across him with infinite tenderness, and both animals released simultaneous sighs of contentment. As darkness claimed the sky and stars began to emerge, Sarah stood at a distance, watching them settle into sleep. Dr. James joined her, and they stood in comfortable silence for several minutes before he spoke. "You know what the most incredible part is," he said quietly. "Everyone looks at this story and sees the elephant who was saved by the dog. But I think it's more than that. They saved each other. Kibo needed Biscoito to survive his trauma, but Biscoito needed Kibo just as much, needed to matter, to have purpose, to be essential to someone. They're two halves of the same miracle." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in her throat. They watched as Kibo's breathing deepened into sleep, his trunk never releasing its gentle hold on the small dog curled against his heart. Biscoito's tail gave one final wag before he too surrendered to exhaustion, safe in the knowledge that he was exactly where he belonged. In the distance, the sounds of the African night began, lions calling to each other, hyenas laughing at some private joke, the whisper of wind through grass and leaves. Life continuing its eternal cycle, beautiful and brutal and miraculous in equal measure. The story of Biscoito and Kibo would continue to be told around the world, inspiring millions with its message of unlikely friendship and the power of compassion. Books would be written, documentaries filmed, children's hearts touched by the knowledge that courage comes in all sizes. The sanctuary would thrive, saving countless more animals, building on the foundation these two had established. But here, in this quiet moment, beneath an acacia tree in the African savanna, none of that mattered. Here there was just an elephant and a dog, a giant and a tiny hero, two souls who had found each other in the darkness and refused to let go. Sometimes the biggest heroes come in the smallest packages. Sometimes love transcends every logical boundary. Sometimes the broken pieces fit together so perfectly that they create something more whole than either could have been alone. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get to witness a friendship that reminds you why life, despite all its pain and difficulty, is so profoundly worth living. As the last light faded from the sky and the stars took over the heavens, Biscoito and Kibo slept peacefully together, living proof that the greatest bonds aren't chosen, they're recognized, nurtured, and held onto with everything you have. Because in the end, that's what love does. It finds you when you need it most, arrives in the most unexpected forms, and if you're brave enough to accept it, transforms everything.